This is episode number 155 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Joining me today is Jan Stocklassa. Jan is an author and journalist focusing on large-scale affairs in international politics. He served as a diplomat for Sweden in the Czech Republic from 1997 until 2003, and later helped found a newspaper in Prague. I invited Jan onto the podcast to discuss his book, The Man Who Played with Fire, Stieg Larsson's Lost Files and the Hunt for an Assassin, published in 2018. Jan spent more than a decade researching the 1986 murder of Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme, a case which is now officially closed, but which still deserves a lot of attention and perhaps to be reopened and reinvestigated as well. He has also produced a documentary based on his book, which is now available on streaming services here in the United States from Discovery. But before we get into this story, I want to tell you about an educational tool you're not going to want to miss. It's the Gray Man Briefing Classified. By now, I think I know my listeners pretty well, and take it from me, this briefing is exactly the news and educational reference source that you've been looking for. You'll get breaking news updates from all over the world on topics including planned protests and riots, low-intensity conflicts, natural disaster alerts, cyber attacks, supply chain disruptions, and more. You'll also get access to articles that help you build your own skills, including urban survival, home security, counter-surveillance, escape and evasion techniques, and more. And this is much more than just a newsletter in your inbox. Joining the Gray Man Briefing Classified also includes invitation-only channels on the Telegram and Signal apps for convenient real-time updates. The newsletter subscription is normally $5 per month, but if you use the code GBC Spycraft, you can save 20% each month for the life of your subscription. I'm already a member myself and have been reading and learning a lot since I first subscribed. Look it up yourself at graymanbriefing.com. That's gray with an A, graymanbriefing.com, and use the discount code GBC Spycraft to save 20% right from the start. Jan, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. I didn't know much about Palme's death until I watched the recent documentary that you produced, but I was completely astonished at the number of twists and turns that it takes, and it definitely rivals the Kennedy assassination here in the U.S., in my opinion, in terms of like the complexities and the ongoing controversy surrounding it.
Definitely. It's the European John F. Kennedy assassination.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way to me. So what led you specifically to investigate his murder for the better part of a decade?
Like so many things in life, I think a lot of coincidences that happened through some years. And sort of the decisive moment was when I found the Millenium author Stieg Larsson's Forgotten Archive. And it turned out that he had actually done a lot of research into the murder. And he had sort of a theory that he really believed in. And when he died, I had to go further.
Right. Can you expand a little bit on that? I think probably most of the listeners are familiar with Stieg Larsson, but just in case they aren't, who exactly was he and how did you come across his archive in the first place?
Well, Stieg Larsson he's probably one of the most famous authors from Sweden. The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, they made films from it. And he actually only wrote 3 books, but he sold 100 million copies of those. But all of them were sold after he died because he signed contracts. He knew he would be rich. He knew that they would make films from it, movies. But he got an advance and he started planning his future. But then he walked up 7 flights of stairs and got a heart attack and died 50 years old.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Well, so everything was published posthumously then?
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
And then there was a big fight among his living partner and his family, and the family took all the money. His partner didn't get anything. So it's sort of a tragedy in itself.
Yeah. Okay, I see. And I'm well aware of the fictional books and the film series as well, but was he like a crime reporter or anything like that as well? I mean, his research obviously is incredible into this true life crime story.
Well, he was also a journalist in real life, and he was actually working at the news agency on the night of the murder. So he got a lot of information immediately after the murder of our prime minister, which was one reason why he started digging into it. Another reason was that he also was mapping out the right-wingers of Sweden. He himself was left-wing, and he was fighting against the right-wingers and the extremists of Sweden at the time. Okay. And it turned out that they were relevant in the murder case.
Yeah, I'm sure that we're going to get into that, certainly. A lot of very interesting ties there, maybe even damning ties, I guess you could say, but we'll talk about that in a moment.
Mhm.
And so how did you, years later, get hold of his archives? Because I know that's such a central part of this whole story.
Yeah, well, I was actually going to write another book, a book about places where double murders had happened. An interesting thing in itself, actually, where I found several places in Sweden where there was a murder, and then maybe 100 years later, or even more, there was a second murder in the same place. Obviously, a different perpetrator. But I was going to write a book about these places, and in one of these places, I found a person who had been a suspect for a long time in the murder of our prime minister. And when I did research into him, I found a paper in an archive that was written by Stieg Larsson. And the person who had the archive said, there may be more. And through some digging and a few months of hard work, I managed to find this archive. And it turned out that there was a lot, actually 20 cardboard boxes full of documents and articles that he had gathered to solve the murder.
Wow, wow, wow. So how long did he himself work on this? Was it like right up until his death, or was it something he finally had to put aside?
He spent hard work for something like 2 years, and then he continued to do the research and trying different theories for another 8 years. So all in all, at least 10 years, and then he died.
Wow. Well, and you yourself were focused on it for around 10 years as well after you got the archives. Is that correct?
Yeah, the 10 years turn out to be a pretty good time, because after that, there's a pretty big chance that you get crazy if you stay too long. So I didn't want to do that, and he obviously didn't even have the choice.
Sure, sure. Understandable. Several times in the documentary, you mention, you refer to it as having the Palme virus. So is it other people as well who are very, very, very interested in this case, even to this day, and are infected, so to speak, in the way that you were to finally get to the bottom of it?
Oh, yes. Yeah, there's a pretty large group, and it's even growing, I would say, like a new generation starting on it. So every year there's a few hundred people that meet on the day of the murder, or in close connection, and on the anniversary, and sit down and try the different theories in a sort of conference. So unfortunately, it's mostly in Swedish, but it's a really interesting thing, and there are almost as many theories as there are people in the room.
Wow. I bet. Yeah, that certainly is echoing the JFK controversy, which is ongoing to this day, especially as they slowly release declassified documents, just little tidbits here and there, which never ends up satisfying anybody, unfortunately. But,
Yeah.
we're not here to relitigate the JFK thing. That's for another episode, certainly. So I understand that Palme was murdered in the end of February 1986. So can you take us back to that night and tell us what was at least initially known on the night that he died?
Yes, it was actually the last day, the 28th of February, Olof Palme, and it was a Friday, winter time, so below 0 centigrade, minus 10, 15 centigrade. You'll have to translate that to Fahrenheit. But it was a really cold night in Stockholm, really dark. But it's also Friday, so it's party night. And he and his wife decided to go to the cinema. This was in the 1980s. Sweden's still a very naive country, and he decided that he would call off his bodyguards. So around 8 o'clock, he left his home together with his wife, took the subway to the cinema without any bodyguards. They didn't have any tickets, but they managed to, it was a sold out movie, but they managed to get some tickets for the prime minister, obviously. And they went in to see the cinema. And by that, anybody who would like to kill him would know that he would come out in something like 2 hours from the movie theater. Afterwards, they were actually there with one son and his girlfriend at the time. Immediately after the movie, they talked for a couple of minutes, and then they parted. They split up. Olof Palme and his wife started walking along one of the largest streets in Stockholm for half a mile. And then when they passed the corner, a person stepped up and shot one shot in the back of Olof Palme, fired another shot that scratched the back of his wife, and Olof Palme was dead immediately. And then the murderer hesitated for a few seconds before he ran off into an alley, a pretty long flight of stairs, and then disappeared forever.
Wow, I've seen some of the footage from the night, and it was clear that this was a horribly unexpected thing for everyone. I guess that no one could conceive that the prime minister might be in danger on the streets right there. Is that your takeaway as well? I mean, nothing like this had happened before in Sweden?
Not for a couple of hundred years. We actually had a king who was killed in a very similar way, like Abraham Lincoln. So when we have murders, they're actually pretty similar to American ones. So in 17 something, our king Gustav III was actually shot in the theater. But then we had much better police because they managed to catch the guy through excellent police work. Actually, a few days later, this time we didn't manage so well. So.
Right. So earlier you mentioned that, there seems like there may have been some right-wing group involvement there. So I take it then that Palme was a left-wing or left-leaning prime minister. I mean, why would people might have conceivably wanted him dead at the time?
He was extremely controversial as a politician, probably the most divisive politician we have had in at least 100 years. Wow. He was social democratic, so he was left-wing, but sort of center left-wing. And he was also extremely intelligent. He actually had a really high IQ, 140, 45 or something like that.
Oh, wow.
He was well-spoken, and but he was also very arrogant. He was tough as a politician, created a lot of conflict, which is not common in Sweden. And then he was also extremely active on the international scene. So inside Sweden, he was half of the people loved him, half of the people disliked him or even hated him. And outside Sweden, it was similar. He was actually very popular in small countries because he was for independence and sovereignty of small countries. But then he was also criticizing the Soviet Union as well as the US. So the superpowers didn't like him very much.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I thought that a lot of people thought that he was falling into the Soviet camp, but you're saying that he also criticized them as well.
Yes, he did. Yeah, yes, he did. But if the right wingers say that he didn't, on the other hand, the left wingers don't think that he criticized the U.S. enough. So it's always from where we start. But
sure,
objectively, he criticized both.
Okay, I see. Would you say controversially, yes, but was there any kind of like celebration? Was anybody, express happiness that he had been killed in Sweden at that time, other than potentially, some of the like extremists who might have been involved in his death? Was anybody, breathing a sigh of relief that he was gone, or was it genuinely just, shock that this had happened at the time?
The occasional extremist or young guy who didn't like him, who was drunk on a Friday night, would celebrate. Otherwise, everybody was actually shocked and astonished that something like this could happen in one of the calmest countries in the world. We always thought that this would never happen. And a vast majority of people didn't approve, of course. So, yeah.
Sure, I would expect so. So did the police investigation, did it develop any obvious or immediate suspects right off the bat? I know that it was a deeply flawed investigation, like you mentioned a couple of minutes ago.
Oh, yes. Yeah, it's fantastic. It's even been the subject for a comedy by an American guy. It's called We Got It. And it's actually 4 or 5 episodes about only the flawed investigation. It's a lot of fun if you take it from that perspective, actually, how they managed to fuck it up, excuse the expression. Yeah. Yeah. So, but there was immediately, or at least pretty soon, even in the night, there were some initial ideas of who done it. But the first real trail was Victor Gunnarsson, I would say. He was called 33-year-old at the time, but his real name was Victor Gunnarsson. And he was a right-winger who had been close to the scene and who had said things like, in the night of the murder, even before the murder, he said, in Sweden, you can get shot in the back for your opinions. And he acted very strangely, and he was definitely someone who could have done it. Also connected to groups of right-wingers that were strange and extreme.
Okay, I see. Was there any direct evidence that tied him to the night of the murder? You said he was nearby. Was he drinking in a bar a block away or something like that, for example?
Yeah, he was drinking in a bar a couple of blocks away.
Oh.
And then he didn't really have an alibi, but later it turned out that he probably had an alibi. They examined his jacket and found some reminiscence of some gunpowder. There was a couple of witnesses that identified him, and then later there were flawed identifications. So there were evidence and indirect evidence that he may have been at least involved in the murder. And that continued for actually a couple of years after the actual murder.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
initially he was suspected of having committed the murder, and then later of being involved in the murder.
Okay. I see. Like, could he have been like a lookout or something like that? You mean like involved in that way?
A lookout,
Mhm.
and also, if to use another word, a famous word in the US, a patsy, someone that they lured to go to be close there, and that they could
Gotcha.
arrest, and that would create a lot of chaos in the investigation, and they definitely managed with that
Oh,
through
wow.
him.
Okay. So was he ultimately arrested?
He was arrested a few days after the murder, and then he was arrested for a couple of weeks, I would say, or a month, before they had to let him go. And then the second time, a year later, when he was only suspected of participation or involvement, then he was not arrested, just informed that he was still a suspect.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So what happened to him in the end? He was only arrested that one time, I take it?
Yeah. Then a little bit later, after the second turn, he decided that he can't live in Sweden anymore. So he moved to the US. He moved to South Carolina, where he loved the US. He was a big fan of the US. And so he actually looked a little bit like, I would say, Elvis Presley or something, and dressed in a jacket with a big American flag and stuff like that. So he was a
Wow.
big fan of your country. I am too. So he moved to South Carolina, and there he led a sort of pretty chaotic life. Also, he started a relationship with a married woman, and then close to in December, a couple of years after the murder of our prime minister, his body was found naked in a forest. There was a lot of snow, and they found this naked body, shot to death. And some people think still that it was part of the murder of our prime minister, but in the end, there was a police officer arrested and convicted also for that. So he always claimed that he was innocent, but he was the husband of the married woman that Victor Gunnarsson had a relationship with.
Okay. So he certainly had a logical motive for wanting Victor dead, aside from the stuff that happened years earlier in Sweden.
Yes, yeah.
Unless he was a patsy as well, which I guess some people think.
Yeah. But there's still some question marks around that. So that murder, but it's a really strange story, and there is a documentary on that particular case also. And I think it's Natural Geographic.
Okay, I haven't seen that one. I'll have to look for that as well. I know it's the story, of course, is covered a little bit in your documentary as well, which was just endlessly fascinating. But
Mm.
has Victor? I guess he's still a hot topic among people discussing Palma. Like, are there still people that think strongly that he may have been the trigger man or a conspirator, or has that kind of been put to rest at this point?
It seems like these theories sort of have a have a lifespan of a few years. So at the moment, I don't really think that people look at him. I think he's really interesting. I don't think he was the trigger man, but I do think that he knew a lot about the murder. There are quite a few indications that he did know that this was going to happen. But at the moment, the last guy who really believed in him, he died some 4 or 5 years ago. And that's what happens when you have a murder case which is already 30, whatever, 7 years
Yeah,
ago.
getting close to 40 years now.
Yeah.
My gosh.
Yeah.
So another main character that you discussed and that I believe you met as well is Bertie Wedin. Is that or Whedon? Is that correct?
Yeah, he's Bertil Vedin.
Bertil.
That's a very Swedish name. My father was called that too, actually.
Oh, okay.
And he was a right winger, and he was ex-military man, but he had also worked as a journalist, and then he was working for Swedish industry in London before he moved to Cyprus and started working for the South African security forces or security police. So he was sort of an intelligence man. He was working for the South Africans. He claimed to have been working for the Swedes, a little bit for the English. And when I met him also in Cyprus, I can tell you more about that. But then he said also that he worked a little bit for the CIA and for a private intelligence service called 61 or Le Cercle in French, the Circle. So he was definitely an intelligence man belonging to the right wing. He would call himself mainly an anti-communist. So,
Okay.
yeah, but he's a Swedish guy, but with a very international role.
Wow. Do you think that these claims are realistic, or he's not just a self-promoter or something like that? Do you think he was really that involved with so many different organizations and countries over the course of his life?
I think he was involved, but I think he worked with. I know he worked for the South African one for several years, and he was paid. That's true. I'm pretty sure he worked externally for the Swedish one, Seppo, and the private one, definitely. That's an interesting story also, the 61. This intelligence, there's an Australian guy, and I lost the name for him, that ran this organization. And that's something that really existed and it was quite important. And they were actually interacting with Ronald Reagan's government and Margaret Thatcher's governments in the UK.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to have to read more about that.
So the short answer is yes, I believe him.
Okay, I see. And honestly, from your recorded video of him in the documentary and from his photo, he looks like a guy who is capable of just about anything.
Yeah,
to me. I totally believe he can make things happen like this if he wanted to. Certainly, just that's the aura kind of that he gives off. Honestly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why I was careful. And I'm a pretty normal guy. I never did these things before. But I went to Cyprus. I bought a sort of a simple digital camera, a photo camera, and I managed to film him and also record him on my iPhone. And I spent 3 days with him. In the end, he started to suspect that I'm not who I say I was. I said I was just going to write an article, but I was actually much more interested in the murder than he thought. So
wow. So how did you get in touch with him to begin with, and what was his perceived connection to Palme's murder?
So Northern Cyprus is not the actual Cyprus that you hear sometimes about. The Northern Cyprus is a tiny country that doesn't really exist. The only country that actually accepts it as a country is Turkey. So it's got 300,000 people in the middle of the Mediterranean, and that's where Bertil lived. He's dead now, but where he lived. So I went there. I had to fly to the regular Cyprus and then take a bus or a taxi actually to Northern Cyprus. And then I started looking around. I went to the post office and found phone books. Remember those?
Yes.
And I found his phone number, which wasn't valid anymore, but I found the address and I managed to track him down there. And it's a tiny place, so it didn't take that long actually. And then before I had the courage to contact him, it took a while though. And when I asked and I said, I'm going to write these articles, and I gave him a few $100 actually, because he was already poor, he agreed to meet me. And we spent three half days together drinking beer and talking about conspiracies.
Amazing. Yeah. So did he think that you were writing on an entirely different subject and you just kind of had to work your way around to the Palme murder then?
Well, he probably knew that I would be interested in, but he didn't know that I knew that much about him and the things that he may have done.
Okay.
But the last day I showed him the paper written by Stieg Larsson, the Millenium author, a memo that Stieg Larsson handed in to the Swedish police, where it says in the beginning, Bertil Vedin is supposed to be the middleman in the murder of our prime minister. So he was supposed to be a middleman between the South African security forces and the Swedish right-wingers.
Okay. So since you've mentioned South Africa several times now, so are you saying then that there were people or elements in South Africa that wanted Palme dead, likely?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, because it sounds really strange that this country on the other side of the globe suddenly wants to kill a prime minister of a tiny country. So the logic doesn't sound, it's not there immediately. But if you know that Palme was actually fighting against the apartheid regime of South Africa at the time, and he was doing that for decades. And Sweden was actually financing the ANC, Nelson Mandela's organization. So to at least 50% of their budget was from Sweden alone.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and he was extremely active in the UN to have sanctions against South Africa. Olof Palme was. So that's one reason, but I don't believe that that's the main motive. I think it was actually arms deals going on at the time. Arms deals where South Africa were actually trading arms with Iran and with other countries and getting oil back and everything. Olof Palme may have been on the way of publicizing this, which was a much bigger threat than his fight against apartheid.
I see. Yeah. I see a couple of very, I wouldn't say good, but understandable reasons why he would be at the top of their list then. I did one episode a while back about the ANC. I spoke to a woman who spied for the ANC for a while, and it was clear that they were willing to take action. The South Africans were willing to take action against the ANC worldwide. I know that they tried to kill a guy in London in 1989, probably a lot of others, as well. So they were not afraid to leave the borders of their own country to execute a type of mission. So I can certainly see how that would be very feasible and potentially realistic.
Yeah.
Them.
And yeah, they did. Yeah, I went to South Africa and met the master spy of South Africa, also Craig Williamson, who in this Truth and Reconciliation Commission actually admitted that he had blown up a bomb in London and killed several people in southern Africa. So they blew up a bomb in London. There was a bomb in the ANC office in Stockholm also in the same year as Olof Palme was killed. So it's pretty likely that they were behind a lot of things that happen in Europe also.
Wow. Okay. And you met Craig Williamson face to face?
Yeah, sure.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I did not realize that. I've heard his name. I'm familiar with him from some other stories, but I did not think that he was easy to get in touch with at all. But you made it happen, sounds like.
Well, he wasn't easy because he thinks that Swedes are hypocrites and naive and everything. So he's not a big fan of Swedish people, especially not Swedish journalists. But we sort of developed a pretty okay the dialogue in the meeting, but also we've been emailing and I've been talking to him a few times. And I sent him the book and he said, I already read it, but he wanted a signed copy. He wrote me an email where he said, I've treated a very complicated matter well.
Oh, wow.
Which I think implies that I'm sort of coming close to the truth.
Wow. That's very high praise. That's incredible. Good for you.
Yeah, thank you.
Not a guy that you want to necessarily, be on his good side or his bad side, really, but that's very impressive.
No, you have to. Yeah, I always stress that he says he didn't kill our prime minister.
Sure, understandable.
Yeah.
So, did your interviews with Bertil and any others that you conducted, did they make you think it was more likely or less likely that this South African connection was real? Then?
More likely. I'm completely convinced that the South Africans were behind it and they were using Bertil Vedin and the Swedish right-wingers as support, lookouts, possible patsies. So there's a lot of evidence pointing to that direction, and I'm convinced that is what happened.
Okay, I see. And since the shooter has never been found, do you think that it was one of these Swedish right-wingers who had being supported, or was it potentially even a South African shooter?
That's where it gets complicated because there's a lot of it points in different directions. Some people say it's actually a very professional murder. Some people say it's not. My belief is that it's not a very professional murder. It's a chaotic murder. The way they shot, they only put one shot in the back of our prime minister, and the second shot was definitely a miss because it's only scratched the widow. I believe that the second shot was actually aimed at our prime minister and that it was a big miss.
Oh, wow.
So, but it may still have been someone who is at least a little bit skilled in treating a revolver. But I think they were under a huge stress because it was unplanned. The place where it happened was unplanned. They knew they would do it that night, but the prime minister went in a different direction than they thought, and everything was much more chaotic. So the actual shooter, that's where it gets complicated. But I think there are two or possibly three possibilities. Two of them are Swedish, and one is, of course, a possibility of a South African shooter.
Okay. Yeah. Do you have three named individuals in mind, or just groups that may have been?
Yeah, I have three named individuals that I believe one of them did it. One is a Swedish police officer, one is a South African, and one is a Swedish right-winger.
Wow. Okay.
But one thing I think I should stress also is that, which may be even more interesting, because South Africa, Craig Williamson said something to me, which he had also said at other times. He said that I did the dirty work for my government, and my government did the dirty work for Western governments, meaning the US and possibly the UK. And that's where it connects sort of to the US, to arms deals, to Iran-Contra, and to a lot of things that are probably you've touched upon in other episodes of your podcast.
Yeah, certainly. Iran-Contra has come up several times, certainly. Very recently, as a matter of fact. And one of the largest events in this, I don't know if it's all this niche, this corner of the world in the mid-1980s, of course, right when this is occurring. So do you think that there was US or UK interest in seeing Palme out of the way of all this? How was he disrupting their own foreign policy potentially?
Then you're already into my new book, which I just it will go to print in Swedish in next week, next Friday.
Oh,
who
okay. I
just
didn't realize that.
finalized it.
Fantastic.
Yeah. I think maybe you were going to ask about that, but it's mainly about another event, the Pan Am 103, the Lockerbie, which in the US is a closed case. The Libyans did it, whatever. In the UK, that's not the case. Most people there believe that it was actually that it was Iran behind it. The Americans shot down an Iranian plane in the summer of 1988, and then in December, the Pan Am 103 happened. And so many people believe, including me, that it was Iran behind it. That's a different story, but there was also a very close associate to Olof Palme on board of that plane. So I'm sort of digging into that deeply, but it goes very deep into the arms deals between the US and Iran. And that's a hornet's nest, whatever you say.
Yeah. Well, quite frankly, I love those subjects, more than any others, I promise you. So hopefully you and I can talk about that book after it's been out for a little while, maybe in a future interview then.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I know there were also 2 U.S. intelligence officers on that flight as well, one for CIA and one for like U.S. Army or Defense Intelligence Agency.
Yeah, Chuck McKee and Matthew Gannon. Yeah, they were there, and they were sitting very close, and the suitcases of the Swedish guy and these 2 Americans they were flying in business, and their suitcases were actually standing next to each other, next to the suitcase where the bomb was.
Yeah, and you got my head spinning right now.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm very excited to read more about this when your book comes out.
Yeah, but let's go back to how they killed our prime minister.
Yes, certainly. One mystery at a time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So another character that you mentioned that has a lot of time in the documentary, he was going by the alias Ricard back then, I believe, or Rickard back then. Can you talk about who he was?
Yeah, he's this very strange guy. He was young. He was 24. He had been hating Olof Palme for many years. Nobody really know who he was, but he traveled from a small town in Sweden to meet with one of the biggest Palme hater in Sweden, a campaigner called Alf Ennerström. He looked him up, and Rickard started working for this Palme hater. So he was doing all these running errands for this right-winger, and Rickard was thinking that he was doing important work. He even thought that he was working for the CIA. He went to the American embassy and claimed to be handing information to the CIA, not completely ruled out. And he was also wearing a wig and meeting with a lot of the people that were suspects in the murder. So
is that what brought him to their attention, was these meetings? I mean, how did he become a person of interest? Just because of his association with Alf?
When he went to the American embassy, they according to him, they sent him to another guy who was working for the Swedish Säpo. He was starting to hand in information using his Rickard pseudonym. And they didn't know who he was. And he was starting to talk about the murder of Olof Palme and that he knew things and stuff. So that's when the Swedish police started to look into him, and they started following him, and in the end they managed to find his real name. But they were investigating him for a year or so. In the end they wrote him off. They didn't believe that he was involved in the murder. But that's also when they went in a completely different direction, and it turned out in the wrong direction. So I believe that he was not the shooter, but he was definitely involved in the murder.
Okay, I see. And I believe that in the photos I've seen in the documentary, he's got this wig on, and they began referring to him as the wig man because it was so kind of ridiculous and out of place looking, right?
Yeah. He was weird looking. He still is quite a peculiar person.
With or without the wig.
Yeah. With or without the wig, very extreme. But it's also a very useful type of person. A little bit like Lee Harvey Oswald, maybe was quite a bit strange also. This person is probably more strange than Oswald, but it's a useful person to have if he doesn't know too much. He was a lookout. He could do things that people would say that it's not possible that he would be involved, but I think he was.
Okay, do you think that he was kind of useful like as a patsy or as misdirection, or was he genuinely like accomplishing some solid things for these people?
I think he was a lookout also, and that's, of course, that's pretty simple. And he, through his boss, this campaigner, he was reporting stuff. So he wasn't directly in contact with any of the people that were higher up in the hierarchy. But then also he could actually function as a patsy, another person who sort of created chaos in the investigation.
I see. I see. And you also were able to track him down and get him to open up a little bit on camera as well, right?
Well, I tracked him down. I tried to approach him several times, even with a reporter from the New Yorker, Nicholas Schmidl. We actually traveled around. We went to South Africa together, and we went to several places in Sweden and to London. And we tracked him down, and we tried to make him talk, and he didn't want to talk. Later, a year later, I actually agreed with a woman, a honey trap, to contact Ricard. And she was wearing camera equipment and sound recording equipment, and managed to meet with him and managed to get him to tell quite a few things that tell about the murder, but he never said, this is how it happened. Lida Komarkova.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she went. She had it's actually described in detail in the book where she had a Facebook dialogue with him where she managed to get quite a lot of information about the murder from him, as well as she also managed to get emails that I got sent to me, the emails of Ricard and Bertil Vedin, because it turned out that Ricard and the middleman in Cyprus, Bertil Vedin, had a long-going relationship. They were friends since a long time, talking a lot about the murder in their emails.
Connections are incredible.
Yeah, and those are connections that the police didn't know about. Then later I asked her to go to meet with Ricard, and she knocked on his door and managed to spend all in all 6 days with him and got quite a lot of information that I think is very relevant in the murder case.
That's incredible. So I was totally confused by her and her kind of story. So you got to know her well. And I think that on camera, she says something like she basically started up these fake profiles online because she was bored. Is that accurate? Was she just a woman who was bored and stumbled into all this? Or was there a lot more going on there than what she would admit to, you think?
I was confused too. That's when the first time she asked me to come to Prague, to go to a particular bar in Prague and order 2 Moscow Mule and wait until she contacted me. Then this pretty young, beautiful woman comes up to me. And so I was confused. But I believe that was the reason. Or I'm pretty sure, actually, that was the reason, that she was doing it for fun. There's no Mossad in the background. There's no real, more obscure thing behind it. And now I know it quite well, so I'm pretty sure that was the case.
Okay, good. Well, I mean, she certainly has the skills for exactly this kind of thing, and seems like some self-taught tradecraft there in that case, very effective tradecraft as well, because she got people to open up about things they wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah. She actually later she got an ADHD diagnosis, which may explain that she likes adrenaline.
I see. Okay. Yeah, some people are just naturals at this, I guess, but talk about the right person in the right place for your story.
Yeah. Good timing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So another thing I want to ask you about, there were these deep search documents that you uncovered. Can you talk about what those were exactly?
Yeah, the deep search documents, they've been around for a while, so it wasn't me, I must say. So there's exactly like the JFK, there are people adding bits and pieces. And the deep search documents were actually, another researcher found these documents, and they talk about, more or less in a code language, that they would kill the Prime Minister of Sweden, the South Africans. And it's sort of signed, some of the documents are signed documents from the government, and some of them there's also a travel reimbursement.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Some of the things seem credible. I think that the government documents actually seem the most credible. This travel document doesn't seem credible. It even says the 29th of February, and that doesn't really exist. But that could be a mistake. But I'm sort of split on that's why I didn't include them in my book, actually, for that reason. But they're definitely interesting to look at, and there may be part of that is true. And I think so.
Okay, I see. And these South African documents, if I recall correctly, they referred to Palme by a very specific phrase, like threat to our national security, something like that indicate that they, believed it would be acceptable to have him killed or kill him themselves. Something like, it was like clear and present danger, something like that we use here in the
Yeah. He was definitely on a death list, South African. So in that sense, that they wanted to get rid of him, that's true. That's sort of proven. That doesn't mean that they did.
Yeah, certainly. It's very easy to jump to the conclusion that is the most interesting or exciting in many different cases, of course, but I know
Mm-hmm.
that you would certainly want to stick with the actual evidence in all cases and kind of
Mm.
manage your expectations and not embellish on things. But I am curious, Jan, after all of this investigation, do you have a pretty clear personal theory of what happened? I know you mentioned one of three different suspects, but is there like a timeline that you've developed or anything like that that kind of lays it all out?
Yeah, I have a timeline. I have two timelines. One is for sort of the period leading up to the murder, so it's more in weeks and days. But then I got one that is for the actual timing of the murder, the 24 hours, let's say from 12 on that day until the next day, because there are things happening before and after. And then, like anybody who's looking into this, I'm sort of taking the witnesses and all the facts that I believe are the important ones, because there's so much. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. 1,000 pieces are relevant, but you have 1,000,000 pieces mixed in there. So you have to find the 1,000 ones that you believe in. And that's how I built my timeline. And of course, it adds up perfectly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Incredible. But yet I know that in 2020, there was a big government press conference about the Palme murder.
Yeah.
And you were kind of watching that live. Can you talk about what happened during that actual press conference and your reaction to it?
Oh, yeah, that's one of the biggest anti-climaxes in Swedish history, I would say. And I think quite a lot of people actually watched it also outside Sweden, because it is really maybe possibly the only unsolved murder of a prime minister in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Most are actually solved. I have another one in the new book, actually, a Portuguese one. But the Swedish police, they said actually a few months ahead of the press conference, and they said, we will present the solution to the Palme murder. And everybody was, wow. So there was a big surge in interest, and everybody was talking about the Palme murder for the few months before that press conference. And in that moment, that morning, Sweden stood still, and so everybody was watching this. The prosecutor, the DA, or whatever you would call it in the US, and the head of the investigation, two pretty sad-looking gentlemen sitting at the low table. They didn't even put the effort into to make it look good. It looked pretty tragic, actually. And then they started saying, almost apologizing immediately, saying that they will now present the most likely suspect in the murder, that you can't really get around this person when we look at it in a slow Swedish sounding voice. And then in the end they said that it was this lone killer, a graphic designer called Stieg Larsson, who also went by the name of the Scandia Man. And that's when the air went out of half of Sweden, I would say, or even more. And in the end, when they finished the press conference, they even said that we only have reason enough to interrogate him, to take him into custody, to interrogate him, nothing else, which means that, and the guy was dead already, so they couldn't really do that. In the end, they only said that we're closing down the investigation. We don't have any real evidence in any way. Even the people that believed in the Scandia Man before were disappointed, because there was no evidence whatsoever. So after 34 years, the investigation was closed down. Everything's forgotten. Nobody wants to dig into this anymore. Not the media, mainstream media, not the politicians. They just want to forget about it.
Incredible. And we haven't mentioned Stieg Larsson at all yet during this talk, but if I recall correctly, he was one of the witnesses on that night, wasn't he? Like, he was interviewed on camera the night of the murder?
Exactly. He was one of the witnesses that was interviewed even in the night of the murder and then the next day. And he was seeking a lot of attention. And one would guess that the person that has killed the prime minister may be a little bit more careful showing his face on national TV and saying that he saw everything, because a witness might have recognized him. In the end, also at the press conference 34 years later, the main argument that they used was that he said that he was at the murder scenes and stayed at the murder scenes as a witness, but nobody saw him. So it's probably the only murder case where the absence of witnesses is used as evidence.
Wow.
Yeah.
So incredible. Yeah. And very convenient that he's already passed away, so nothing else can be done.
Yeah. And everybody who knew him said that no way. He couldn't have done it. He was a coward. He could never do anything like that. And if he would do something, he always bragged about everything he did. He was this megalomanian person who would always wanted to tell about everything he did. So that combination, too coward, and he talks too much, that doesn't really add up.
Right. Yeah, not a good profile for a would-be assassin, certainly.
No.
Well, so is there any chance that this case will ever be reopened, or is it definitively closed, officially, permanently, everything?
There's a tiny chance. I actually managed to track down a couple of guys who found a walkie-talkie, because there are all these witnesses that have seen people with walkie-talkies around the murder scene mainly before, and then a couple after the murder also. But there had been no walkie-talkies. The police never found any walkie-talkies. But I heard from a friend about some guys that have found a walkie-talkie immediately after the murder, or 2 days after the murder, close to the murder scene, along the path where the murderer ran away. And I managed to track them down, and we handed it in to the police. But now, by asking for the documents, what they did with it, we realized that they didn't do anything with it. Because they were already convinced that there was this lone killer who did it.
Yeah.
And then the walkie-talkie wouldn't fit in. So I actually sent it to the Uppsala University, to the forensic department there, where they do DNA checks. And they're the best in Sweden and probably one of the best in Europe on doing that. And they found 4 different types of DNA inside, not on the outside, because they're, I also sent in 3 DNA profiles that they should exclude, which was mine plus 2, who had handled the walkie-talkie. And the DNA that they found was either in the microphone or in the battery compartment. But we need them to start up the investigation to be able to find the persons.
Man. So do you have hope between then the book and the documentary and your ongoing campaign that it will be reopened, or is this almost like a personal quest for you now?
I'm writing books. Otherwise, I get crazy. Yes, I would get crazy. So I'm sort of, I have a quest for a couple of years, and then I switch. So this time I'm trying to solve the Lockerbie, the Pan Am 103. In the end, I actually think it's all around arms deals, and the US and the CIA, the Frank Carlucci, the William Casey, the Richard Secord, the Richard Armitage, Oliver North, the things that they were doing with Iran caused a lot of things to happen in the 1980s.
Yeah, all those names are very familiar to me and to my listeners as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm sure. And of course, it's great that you won the Cold War. But it was at the price. Possibly the Swedish Prime Minister had to pay with his life.
Yeah, no question about it. There were a lot of proxy conflicts, proxy tragedies, that sort of thing that were, considered acceptable by both sides, I think, and it really is just a 50 plus year of just ongoing tragedies, honestly, all over the world, because of these two superpowers grappling with each other without getting into a full-on fight, which is, it's endlessly interesting, but it's very tragic as well, no question about it.
Yeah, we had sort of a break for a couple of decades, at least less, and then suddenly once again there's another Cold War coming. Ongoing. Yeah.
History is cyclical in some ways, I suppose.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. Wow. Well, Jan, this has been incredibly fascinating. This is one of my new favorite subjects now, I have to admit, and I'm very glad to have had the opportunity to learn about it from you. I know that the book that you wrote about this is The Man Who Played with Fire, Stieg Larsson's Lost Files, and The Hunt for an Assassin, for those of you who want to read a lot more about the case. And can you tell me the title of your book that's about to come out now?
Yeah, in Swedish it would be Mannen som föll från himlen, jakten på den bortglömde terroristen. So you hear some Swedish also. It's the language of honor and glory, of course.
Of course.
No, but in English it would be The Man Who Fell from the Sky, The Hunt for the Forgotten Terrorist.
Wow.
And without revealing too much, I find a terrorist that the CIA didn't manage to find 35 years ago.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah. Okay, I'm excited. Is there an English version coming soon, or is it exclusively in Swedish for now?
Oh, at the moment, I'm sort of finding an agent. So if anybody has got an agent that wants to sell 500,000 copies of a great book, then just contact me.
Okay, wonderful. I will do my best to help you out any way that I can.
But there will be an English one. I'm pretty sure that there will be. It will probably take a year or so.
Okay, certainly sounds like it will be worth the wait in that case. I'm really looking forward to it. And now that is coming out, do you have another project in mind after that, or are you going to continue working on this book for the time being?
Well, it's a trilogy. So I'm thinking of the third part that would sort of connect everything, and that will focus on arms deals even more. Bofors is a Swedish arms deal that is partly owned by United Defense also. So it's once again a connection to the US. And that's what sort of connects everything, the arms deals. And that would wrap everything up. And everything sort of starts, also in the second book and the third book, starts with documents from Stieg Larsson's archive.
Wow. Okay, exciting stuff coming from you then, no doubt about it.
Hope so.
Great. So, Jan, do you have a website or social media profile, anything like that you can share in case people want to follow along with your ongoing work?
So the website would be www.stocklassa, STOCKLASSA.com. That's the website. And otherwise on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, just look for my name, John Stocklassa.
Okay. Will do. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This has been a great talk, Jan, and I look forward to your future work as well.
Yeah, good talking to you, Justin. Look forward to talk to you next time again.
Yeah, I certainly hope so as well.
Yeah, okay.
Until then.
Okay, until then. Take care.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my pages on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.